We must keep the rate of growth of government spending at reasonable and prudent levels.
Candidate Reagan advocated less government.
We must reduce personal income tax rates and accelerate and simplify depreciation schedules in an orderly, systematic way to remove disincentives to work, savings, investment, and productivity.
Candidate Reagan advocated cuts in federal taxes.
We must review regulations that affect the economy and change them to encourage economic growth.
Candidate Reagan advocated reducing government intervention in the economy.
We must establish a stable, sound, and predictable monetary policy.
Candidate Reagan advocated moderate and stable growth of the economy.
Thank you very much.
And the voters responded by giving candidate Reagan an overwhelming mandate when he was elected president. President Reagan tried to keep his promises, but like most presidents, he was only partly successful. Economist Milton Friedman explains why this occurred. He discusses a political phenomenon, tyranny of the status quo.
Everywhere, whether in the United States, Great Britain, France, or Germany, a new administration has just about 6 months to make major changes that will benefit the community at large. Those changes will have bad effects on small concentrated groups. The bad effects will be visible and immediate. The good effects will be less visible, take longer to manifest themselves, and longer to be recognized. Unless the occupant of that house, Republican or Democrat, makes such changes in the first few months after being elected or re-elected, the tyranny of the status quo will assert itself and prevent further change.
In Tyranny of the Status Quo, we will examine government's potential to act as an agent for change. Joining Dr. Friedman are young adults from throughout the United States. These men and women will share the rewards or suffer the consequences of today's political decisions. Like all of us, they want improvements in our society. Like all of us, they have many different ideas as to how those improvements can be achieved.
I would like for us to explore the problem of why is it that what I assert to be a distinct change in public opinion has not succeeded in changing actual policy. What is it about the tyranny of the status quo? What is it about the role of pressure groups? What is it that has produced this result? And I would like to attack that problem, that issue, by discussing some of the broad areas of policy that have been very much in the forefront and have been very important in the past 2 years. We have, as you know, in this country, a very large expenditure of governmental funds on higher education in the form of state universities, which are financed out of state or maybe city or local groups, also in the form of federal subsidies to higher education, directly to the institutions, and indirectly to students in the form of subsidized loans of various kinds, grants, also grants without condition. And the question I want to raise is whether those higher education expenditures are a justifiable activity of government and what their consequences are, whether they really are a desirable element of a welfare state. I may say my own view has always been very simply that they are not, the reason being that in the main, the benefits go to the individuals who get the higher schooling, the students on the one hand, that those students tend to be in the middle or upper income groups. Either their parents are from that group or they themselves will be in that group when they get out, whereas the funds come from people all over, so that you have a case in which you are imposing taxes on relatively low income people to confer very large benefits on upper income people.
I agree that I think the subsidies are regressive and that the wrong people are paying for it. On the other hand, I think there are some sectors of the world which economics should stay out of and which private interests should stay out of. And I think education is one. I think as soon as you start offering people economic incentives to get educated or to use the education that they get for economic means, in other words, once you put a price tag on knowledge, I think you're going to be
What are you talking about? You mean to say that the graduates of colleges and universities don't use their capacities in the direction which is influenced by the incomes they can earn?
Not completely, no.
Oh, but neither do the people who don't go to college. Nobody is completely dominated by the highest income. So in what respect, in what way do you think that governmental financing of higher education in any way changes the incentives to which the individuals who get the education react?
Well, it's hard to talk about this without having the possibilities before us. Let me tell you, one possibility I've heard is that people would, in effect, invest in me. If I went to college, somebody would say, he's probably going to do well, so we'll pay him to go to college, and then as he makes money, he'll pay us back. And it's a good investment. That gives, first of all, they're going to judge people not on how well they get educated, but how well they're going to do after college. So right there, I think that's a subversion of the educational process.
Let's stop for a moment.
Okay.
You think that the grantors of government higher education are judging the expenditure of that education by how good the education is? How do you explain the fact that the most eminent universities, disproportionately contributing to the Nobel laureates or other marks, are the non-governmental as opposed to the governmental institution?
Well, I mean, I think private institutions are, in general, better, though certainly there are very good state institutions.
Well, I feel that there's a basic assumption that has to be challenged, and that's that the students by themselves benefit. If you believe that society places education as a goal worthy of attainment, and that by having a more educated society, society will benefit, then I feel that no one is losing out by having an individual going to a university and becoming a professional.
Let me ask you a question. Did society benefit from the development of the microcomputer industry in the Silicon Valley?
I feel that every step
taken
forward, society does benefit from.
Did society benefit from that?
I'm not familiar with that one example.
Well, did society benefit from Henry Ford's introduction of the Model T Ford?
Yes, I think it did.
Should the society therefore have subsidized Henry Ford to produce a Model T?
Subsidy, see, that issue is not really relevant to the
Why
issue
not?
at hand.
This is a subsidy.
But if you use the example of education, sticking with higher education, the assumption has been made that there are a group of people who are giving and are not receiving in return. I think that is false, because although there are a group of individuals who are poor and they may be taxed, and these taxes go towards financing someone's education, they are not losing out, because society is benefited by having a core of people who indeed do attain education.
Excuse me, that's my whole point. Society was benefited by Henry Ford's producing it. The poor people you're talking about benefited by Henry Ford's doing it. And yet you do not believe that government should have used compulsory taxation to generate that benefit. Where's the difference?
If it had to get the Henry Ford's achievements, if it had to get to
in those states,
then I think,
well, let's go back. Let's look at the evidence.
Okay.
If you look at collectivist states like Russia, China, they are states which use the same means for getting the Henry Fords that they use to finance higher education. And what kind of Henry Fords do they get? But I want to stick to this component of the welfare state, higher education. How do you justify using tax funds? Do you suppose, let's suppose you did not have any tax funds. Would there be institutions of higher education?
Yes, there would be, but you would have a different brand of people going there.
How do you know?
The ones who would benefit would be those who are wealthy and can afford it. As it stands now, in America, which is the greatest thing about America in my mind, you can go to a college and go to an institution of higher learning without having to worry about finances, because there are means available.
You are a very young man, Gary. Historically in the United States, people of every income class have been able to get through college and universities, whatever the income of their parents. Now,
are you saying there's equal access?
No, I didn't say there's equal access. There are many respects in which people are not equal. And this is no different from others. The opportunity for a person to set up in a business is not independent of the wealth of his parents. It doesn't follow from that the government ought to set everybody up in business. What I'm trying to argue is that, as a matter of fact, historically, it has been possible. I speak personally. I come from a family, my parents never had an income which would have qualified for the poverty level by modern standards. And I worked my way through college, and hundreds and thousands and millions of other people did the same thing. The question is, if you want to go to college, who should pay for it? You or somebody who isn't going to go to college?
it is in the best interest of every black individual, regardless of his station in life, to make sure that more blacks go to college and become professionals. Therefore, by using your logic, you would say by that one black person living in Harlem who does not have the funds available, he should not be made to give $1 of his paycheck to go to a person who's going to
The
college.
right word is made. There have long been black colleges and universities supported in large part by contributions from the black community. That's a voluntary activity. The question at issue is whether it is appropriate to make them contribute.
I think it is appropriate because that's something which I and a lot of other people deem as being very important.
Excuse me, for a moment, let's suppose you didn't go to Union College. You would have conducted some other career. You might have made even more money in that other career.
I may not be as influential. That's the key.
But you might have made more money in that. You might have had more funds to put back. You might have been more influential.
Oh.
The question is, why should I subsidize you in going to college, but not subsidize you for a moment in setting up a business?
As I stated, it depends on the goal of society.
Society doesn't have goals. People have goals.
Well, people
you
make
have
up society.
Common goals, of course. But insofar as their goals are common, they can do it through voluntary contributions.
Why should factory workers, or why should a poor black factory worker have to work an extra hour a week in order to send any of us to college?
Well, there's good and bad points to everything, but just because others get on the bandwagon and also benefit does not mean that we should not allow those who are on the lower strata to
Just
benefit.
others, it's most of the people who go to college are middle class.
There is
or
no
wealthy.
governmental program in the country which so clearly takes money from low-income groups and gives it to high-income groups.
But you're making the assumption that you have a group of people who are in lower classes paying for the higher echelon. Well, the higher echelon doesn't really have to get the money to go to school.
I beg your pardon. Doesn't have to, of course.
They
But
have
it
other
does,
means.
But it does.
But the
If I
money
take the
taken-
people who are going to Berkeley, here in California, the University of California, that's a state university, it doesn't have any tuition, it does have some fees. If you look at the average income of the parents of the people who are going there, this was done some time ago in all the state universities in California, 50% of the students came from the upper 25% of the income class, and 5% of the students came from the bottom 25% of the
Well, if that's the current state of affairs, then that is not fair. But that does not mean we should scrap the whole institution of government subsidizing
Well,
education.
you tell me how you would arrange the subsidies.
Well, I don't have any easy answers, but I still wouldn't say scrap the whole system. And I think that's where we differ.
It
It
seems to
so
me
happens that the oldest form of government subsidization of education was for higher education. And it is inherent in higher education that it will in fact be regressive. But now look, here you are defending, two of you at least, defending these this welfare state payments to students going to institutions of higher education. Do you feel the same way about welfare for business?
I think if we can't get a great car through private industry, and it's, if getting a good car is a good in itself, which it is, then we should federally fund it. Yeah.
And how are you going to, who is going to decide, and how are you going to decide whether government is more effective in doing that than private in the market itself?
It's not a question of who's more effective. I think I would agree that, especially in getting a good car, the private is always more effective. But we're taking a hypothetical case where the private market won't do it.
Well, let's not take hypothetical cases.
Okay.
Let's take real cases, for example. Here is a Chrysler Corporation.
Right.
The government, in effect, bailed it out by guaranteeing it a loan. Should the government have guaranteed that
Yeah.
loan?
And not on principle. I really can't defend it on principle. But the fact is that a tremendous amount of our population is reliant on the auto industry and on Chrysler in particular.
What would have happened if Chrysler had gone bankrupt?
I don't know.
Would have continued to operate. But it would have operated under a receiver. The people who would have been hurt would have been the people who owned Chrysler shares or who had loaned money to Chrysler. In fact, the odds are that the properties would have been taken over by more efficient automobile producers, and for all I know, you would have had more jobs for all. Now, the question is, that's why I say this is welfare. The Chrysler loan is a form of welfare to the people who own stock and bonds, just as government subsidies to higher education is a form of welfare for the students who are in higher education.
Nobody would argue that what we did to Chrysler we should do for every folding firm. Right. But I think government
Only
has...
for the largest firms, then?
Only for the firms that can bounce back, as Chrysler did. And I think congressmen looked at that very closely before they voted for the grant or the loan. But I think government does have an opportunity to provide security. It's not fair to a Chrysler employee that he gets laid off and he gets impoverished because Lee Iacocca or somebody on the top of Chrysler made a mistake. So the government has the opportunity to offer him some security, and that's basically what we go to government for security.
But the government does provide a lot of that security by providing unemployment insurance, by providing all sorts of assistance for people who are put out of work.
So
the only question at stake here is whether he is in addition entitled to a job which brings in much more pay than the average American makes, producing products which nobody wants for the benefit of a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Again, you're switching it to industries that won't bounce back. In this case, we had an optimum use of security. He became secure, and at the same time, he got to work and contribute.
I don't see how we can know that it was optimum, because we don't know what would have happened with that plant if it had been broken up and divided under new management. It might be that other people in Lee Iacocca could have managed that plant much more effectively. And maybe the workers who would have been working for that management would be better off today than if they had stayed, under Iacocca's management. In any event, I just don't see why the government should be supporting Lee Iacocca any more than it should be supporting, middle-class college students.
The Great Depression of the 30s brought distress to the farm. Prices plummeted, surpluses accumulated. In response, government initiated subsidies to support the prices of farm products. They are still with us at an estimated cost to the American taxpayer of over $21 billion this year.
It was designed to be a short-term program to take care of our burdensome supplies and to raise commodity prices, and that's the reason I went into it.
Obviously, many farmers, big and small, real farmers and professionals quick to cash in on a good thing, have benefited from these programs. They would loudly protest the end of these benefits, but everyone else would reap both lower taxes and lower food bills.
We have higher productivity, and that should help the consumer. But the problem is that the government has intervened and put support on milk, which means they guarantee the price that is going to be paid for powdered milk and butter and cheese and things like that. And in doing this, the government has made it very profitable to produce milk, and we can produce all the milk we want. We know we're going to get a price for it, so we just keep producing, and we produce more and more and more. Therefore, we've generated a huge surplus, and the government can't afford to keep buying this surplus. And so I think in the end, the best thing would be for the government just to get out of it, allow supply and demand to take over. Of course, if there's too much milk, then the price is going to go down, and this is good for the consumer. If there's great demand for milk, then the price is going to go up, and we'll produce more.
Some farmers would just as soon get rid of the artificial prop of government support, but the tyranny of the status quo has so far prevented that from happening.
The welfare state is a many-headed giant. I was going to say monster, but I figured I'd better say giant. Now I want to turn to another head of the welfare state, and that is the subsidies to agriculture. Those are a major matter. They amounted in the last year to about $12 billion, if my memory serves me right. They have been getting larger rather than smaller. They go to subsidize people who produce everything from tobacco to dairy products to wheat to corn, you name it, and there's a subsidy program for them. Of course, it's not labeled subsidy. It's always labeled a price support program. And the form which it takes is that the government guarantees the farmer that if the price at which he can sell his product falls below a certain level, the government essentially buys up the surplus, buys up what can't be sold at that price and stores them. And as a result, we have mountains of goods, cheese, dairy products, and storage. And it's worth noting that this is a phenomenon not only in the United States, but around much of the Western world. Europe has a butter mountain, which it's trying to dispose of, and so on. Now the question is what can we say about agricultural subsidies? Are they an appropriate element of a welfare state?
Well, it seems a little simple for those of us who have no experience in with farmers to say that we're absolutely opposed to agricultural price supports. But I think that if we had a little bit more familiarity with what life was like when you were at the mercy of the weather and you had no idea whether you were going to be able to sell your crop from one year to another because you didn't know in advance what your crop was going to be like, it seems like something of a reasonable way to try to stabilize people's income source.
Well, if I understand your argument, you're saying that the government should provide crop insurance, which is a very different thing from price support.
How is it different?
Unemployment insurance is a very different thing from guaranteeing you a price for your labor.
Well, I guess that might be a preferred alternative way to make sure that people were not going to starve when they had a bad year, when everyone had a good year. And
Well,
they
if
weren't
there's
going
one thing that the farmers are pretty well protected against, it's starving.
Although they're losing their houses and their farms.
Yes, many of them are losing their houses because they have borrowed a great deal of money on the basis of their houses. We tend to think, you see, the image you people are projecting is the image that is common in the United States, for good reasons, of the small pioneer farmer on a small plot of land that is scraping the ground to earn a living. Now, in fact, most farmers in the United States who are really commercial farmers have properties and assets that have to be measured in the millions of dollars, not in the tens of thousands of dollars.
One of the reasons that I presume that we provide those kinds of subsidies, and I think it's not always the case that they're referred to as something other than subsidies, is that we want to ensure that people stay in the business of agriculture and that there's a certain diversity of products available.
If we want to assure that people stay in the business of agriculture, we've been doing a lousy job because the number of people in agriculture has been declining drastically. You know, there's no industry in the United States which comes closer to being a high-tech industry. At the outset of the American Republic in 1776 or 8, it took 19 farmers to feed themselves and one other person, 95% of the population. And today, it takes less than one farmer to feed himself and 19 other persons.
Right. I understand there have been, in fact, lots of small farmers dropping out of the business and the agricultural business remaining. Perhaps we could change to a more central question, which I have for you, which is that you characterize this as though the $12 billion which we spend in subsidies is a kind of loss, and that if we didn't spend that, we would be better off. And what I would like you to do is flesh that out a little bit.
Well, the effect of spending the $12 billion is mostly to induce farmers to spend money to grow crops which go into storage. Now, who benefits from that?
Or which might be, in fact, sold abroad.
Well, that's a more difficult problem. If we try to sell them abroad, we can only sell them at the world price. The world price is below the domestic support price. And so, in effect, the difference is precisely the subsidy that is being paid to farmers. Now, if we offer a higher price at home than is available in the world market, it has to take an act of government to export. See, let's suppose we had no price supports. We weren't spending this $12 billion. It would be the same price abroad and at home. You would have a world market for all of these products. And what wasn't sold at home would be sold abroad, and we would, in fact, be exporting at least as much as we're now exporting. In addition, however, the program makes food more expensive and imposes a cost on all of the people in the community who consume food. Agriculture is one of our major export industries. We have had a very large movement toward protection. And this carries us back to the automobile industry, because here there is a very close connection. The argument is that Japanese automobiles have been coming into the country and taking jobs away from American workers in Detroit. And we ought to do something about it. We ought to impose a tariff on it, or we ought to impose a quota. Or what we have done is to have what's called a voluntary quota on the part of the exports from Japan. Now, the question is, that's another component of the welfare state. And what is there to say about that?
The underlying claim is that we would all be better off if there were no constraints placed on anything. And I think that a certain comparison can be made between the American governmental support structure and support structures of West Germany and Japan. It's not clear to me that part of that comparison usually ends up saying that Japanese are better off than Americans because of the competitive advantage that they've gained in the car industry. Japan, as well as the United States, imposes similar kinds of constraints on what they import.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Most countries around the world.
Right. The question is, if we're talking about our position vis-a-vis Japan, and both of us have certain kinds of export and import quotas, can we clearly tie the fact that we're worse off to those export
Well,
and import
let's for a
quotas?
moment come back, and I want to tie it back into agriculture and ask a question. Let's suppose that we did do everything the automobile industry asked. We cut off imports of automobiles from Japan. Who would suffer?
Those of us who drive Toyotas.
And who else?
And who else?
Yeah, who else?
Oh, I'm not sure what...
The farmers. You said they were a big export industry.
Oh.
Where does Japan get the money to buy their exports? Japan is a big importer of food from the United States. Where does it get its money?
Well, I agree that they're interconnected. There would also be certain people who might benefit, those who would not be displaced.
Of course, I'm not saying there would be. I didn't say they wouldn't.
Right.
Of course, if you cut off all, the people who would benefit would be the automobile workers, the steel workers in the United States who would produce American cars instead of Japanese cars. The people who would lose, obviously, are the people who buy the cars and drive them. But the thing that's more interesting, and the reason I brought it in this connection, is because of its tie-in with agriculture. Because I suspect that if you went to farmers, and asked them the question, how would you be affected by increase in the tariff on automobiles? Very few of them would say, my God, that would do me a great deal of harm. For at least 200 years since Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, there has been an almost unanimous agreement among economists that tariffs impose a net loss. And that hasn't prevented country after country from having tariffs and adopting them.
We can't guarantee that there will be a tariff-free market for our products
Of course
abroad.
not. Of course not. And two wrongs don't make a right. It would be better for the world if all the other countries would also go in for no tariffs. But even if they go in for tariffs, we are better off not having tariffs.